So this week, I thought rather than setting you three small things to do, we'd do one big thing this week and do one big thing next week. So what we're going to do this week is we are going to plan a comparison essay, and I'm going to talk you through it because I know some of you guys have done a poetry essay with me before. Some of you may have done one with another teacher, but not with me. So I'm going to talk you through how to do it. You should have already downloaded from Satchel 1, Show My Homework, a planning sheet to use. If you've printed it off and you're writing onto it, that's fantastic. If you are typing straight onto the Word document, that's also brilliant. And if you find that it's a lot easier just to look at it and write it on a piece of paper and do it that way, fantastic. Could I please ask you to submit copies of these plans to me on Show My Homework this week? That's one. And I'll have a look through them and give you all some feedback. Okay, so here we go. So first thing I'd like you to do, 5 questions on the board, as we'd normally do. I'd like you to pause the recording now and see whether you can answer those questions. So questions are, how many poems are printed in the exam? How many poems do you need to compare? How many marks is the question worth? How long should you spend on the essay? And what do you need to do before you start writing? No trick questions. Most of them you should already know. So pause your video now. Okay, guys, so let's go through the answers. So the first thing, there's one poem from our cluster, which is the Power and Conflict. And there is one from another cluster, which is called Love and Relationships. You don't need to worry about that one. You need to find your poem cluster, which is Power and Conflict. It's usually the second one in the booklet. Okay, so how many poems do we need to compare? We need to compare 2, one that is chosen for you and one that you can choose yourself. Now, this does mean that you can pick poems that you feel most comfortable with, but you do have to make sure that you know most of the poems fairly well so that that poem that comes up on the exam isn't a surprise. How many marks is the question worth? The question is worth 30 marks. There are no marks available for spelling, punctuation and grammar on this one, but it is still worthwhile making sure that your spag is fantastic, because then that way we can understand what you've written. How long should you spend on the essay? You should spend, it's broken down into planning, writing, proofreading, checking your work. And what do we need to do before we start writing? This is my magic word, plan. In order to be able to do a really good essay, you need to plan. It is that simple. If you start writing before you have planned, it devolves into mush by the end of it. Okay, so now we're suitably warmed up. On to our plan. So the question we are looking at today is compare how poets present war in Remains and one other poem. So the first thing I'd like you to do for me now, please, is I'd like you to look at that question. It's written on your sheet, and I would like you to highlight the 3 important words from the question. Pause the video, highlight those 3 words. Okay, now you're back. Here we go. These are the words I would have highlighted. Now you'll notice I've actually highlighted a couple of extras. There are 3 key ones, and there are a few others that I thought we'd go through as well. So the first one, compare. This is the only segment of scene texts in literature where you have to compare. And obviously we're talking about similarities and differences. What is the same? What is different? What is somewhat similar? What is completely different? All of those things. Okay. The second key word is always going to be how. And if you remember, how always means what methods are used. Do they use imagery? Do they use structure? What sort of form is it? All of those things. Now, the third key word you should have picked out is present, which means to show ideas. Okay, we want to know what ideas have been shown to us in both poems. And that's why I've highlighted war and one other poem, because war is our focus and one other poem means you do not get anywhere near the amount of marks you should do. I believe they cap you at something like 6 out of 30 if you do not write about both poems. You don't have to write about them in equal amounts, And you don't have to focus on the poem that they've given you. You can focus on a different poem and just tap in with remains, but that's entirely up to you. So what I'd like you to do now is you will see on your sheet, you have this box where you are going to rewrite the question in your own words. So I'd like you to do that for me now, please. Pause the video. Okay, so we should now know what our question is asking us to do. Your understanding of the question should be something along the lines of talk about the similarities and differences in the way methods are used to show ideas about war in Remains and one other poem. It's a bit more wordy, but sometimes when you rewrite it into your own words, it does make life a lot easier for you. Okay. So the next thing we have to think about is our poem of choice. So we have all the poems that you have studied on the screen in front of you right now. Some of them you may not have studied if you are in the group that I took on from Miss Hassan, but you should have studied most of these. So what I'd like you to do now is I would like you to pause the video again, and I would like you to write down 3 poems you could choose. Okay, so pause the video. Okay, so the poems that you could choose from. Basically, any poem that's about war, which you will find is most of them. Bayonet Charge would work very well. Poppies would work very well. Kamikaze would work very well, so would War Photographer, Charge of the Light Brigade, Exposure. All of these poems are poems that we have already studied that are about war and the effects of war. And they're quite interesting. Now, it's up to you how you compare them. It might be interesting to look at 2 soldiers' perspectives, so Bayonet Charge, Exposure would be brilliant there. At the same point, it might be interesting to look at a civilian perspective, Poppies, War Photographer, Kamikaze. Charge of the Light Brigade is an interesting one because it actually talks about the reporting of war. Okay, what we see in the news, what we see has happened in comparison to real life experience in Remains. The key things to make sure of is that when we're looking at a question like this, we don't talk about things like Ozymandias, The Prelude, My Last Duchess, and London. They are not poems about war. London does mention war. You could argue about conflict in Ozymandias, but they are not going to make for an easy comparison. Go for the easy comparison. That way you can spread your wings with the most interesting stuff. So now you've put down your 3 poems. What I want you to do is I want you to pause the video again, and I'd like you to highlight one, and then I would like you to write down underneath why you've picked it. You can be as honest as you want. If it's, I know this poem better, if it's, I think this poem's easier, that's up to you. Be honest with yourself. Pause the video. Okay, so moving on. So we've got our 2 poems. Now, I am not going to tell you which poem to choose. That's your choice. So we've got Remains, the poem the examiner has chosen, and it's printed on your copy of the plan. In the exam, you will literally just get that poem. You will get nothing else. So we then have to look at Remains, and we have to think about which things we are going to talk about. Now, you've watched my video on Remains, so you know all the things that Remains is about, and there is nothing stopping you from pausing this video and watching that video again. Okay, so the 3 things that I've picked to look at are: war is traumatic. Remains is about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, so it's logical to talk about trauma and how terrified the young man Rob is. Okay. War changes people. Now, that's a really interesting one with Remains, because he talks about when he comes home and he's dreaming about things and how he can't get rid of it, and how he talks about drink and drugs. Okay, so it changes people. And you could look at the way that his vocabulary changes as he goes through, how he stops being so la-di-da and happy and talking about using colloquial language and slang, and he becomes far more distant. And then the final thing I'm going to talk about is war is frightening. That's quite an easy one because there's so much you could write about in Remains that's scary. And you can then pick those things up in the poem that you have chosen, because, as I said, I'm not going to tell you what to write about with the poem that you've chosen. That is your choice. But the key thing is, when we are taking this plan and we've got our points that we want to make up, okay, we then need to think about similarity and difference. Now, as I said, I'm not going to tell you which points to talk about with the poem you've chosen. And similarly, with remains, you don't have to use my points. But I will give you some examples. So if we're talking about war being traumatic, we could look at exposure, for example, and we could talk about the way that we're told the structure continually talks about nothing happening. Okay, we could talk about, with exposure, looking at that, we could talk about how war is slow in exposure because nothing happens. But we could also talk about war is frightening there. So we've got two similarities, one difference. If we're talking about something like War Photographer, for example, which I think is an excellent poem to go with this, war is traumatic. Again, we can talk about a similarity there because we can talk about the fact that the ghost in the picture, talk about war changing people. Definitely similarity there. This man is sitting there talking about how he's having to cope with this, and war being frightening. Again, similarity, but done in a slightly different way. Looking at that image that brings to mind the little girl in Vietnam. You could talk about kamikaze, war being traumatic. We're not showing war as being traumatic for soldiers here, but we are told how far-reaching war is when we talk about his daughter talking about, the possibility of trying to explain what's happened in the future. War changing people. Well, it changes her entire family. They don't refer to him anymore. And war isn't shown to be frightening here, but war is shown to be about honor. And that's something you could talk about with kamikaze. But the key thing here is making sure that you know the similarities and differences. Okay, so you're going to pause the video now, and you're going to write down 3 things that you could talk about with remains and 3 things that you could talk about with the poem you've chosen. Okay, welcome back. God, this is so weird. When I get back to school and tell you guys about the weird stuff this has been, this is very odd, but never mind, we're going to keep going. So, obviously, part of this is talking about the context, and you'll see that there's a box on your sheet that talks about context. Now, I've actually given you the context for remains at this point, because I think that, first of all, I think the context for remains is really easy, and I think you'd come up with it very, very quickly. Whereas the poem of your choice, I don't know what you've chosen. I'm not psychic. So you will need to pick your own. But I've only picked 3 very, very brief points. Okay, I've talked about PTSD, I've talked about the Gulf War, and I've talked about the real life experiences, the interviews. Remember, Remains was written for that documentary, The Not Dead. So what you need to do now is you need to go back to the poem of your choice, look at your notes and write down 3 things you could say about the context of the poem that you've chosen. Now remember, context should be part of the why section of your paragraphs. It doesn't need to be long and it shouldn't be sandwiched in. We don't want to be saying things like, the social context of this poem is, okay? We need to be saying the writer has chosen to write about this because. The reader should be aware of this because. Okay, so pause your video, write down your 3 things. Okay, back to me again. So obviously when I'm pausing the video, you guys can take as long as you want on that. Okay, so here is your basic planning sheet. Your what, how, why, compare. Now you're used to seeing what, how, and why. Okay, we do those all the time when we did A Christmas Carol. We use that all the time. We've used it when we're looking at our language questions. So as you can see from this, I have written down my 3 points on the left-hand side for remains, and then there are gaps on the other side for my other. So on your sheet, you will have war is in those boxes. I've written in traumatizing, changes people, frightening, because those are my points. If you want to use my points, you are welcome to, but you can write your own points if you think you've got better ones, and you probably have, to be quite frank. So my how box is split into 2. How, quotation, show me and how method, what has been done. And then my why box has also been split down in that way. Why has it been done? What effect has it had on the reader? Why has it been done? What can you tell me about the context? Okay, so this now. Okay, so the quotation I picked for war is traumatizing is I've gone for dream and he's torn apart. Now I could actually get more of that quotation down, but the thing I want to focus on is that torn apart. And what I'm going to talk about there with my method is I'm going to talk about violent imagery to emphasize the soldier's reaction. I could talk about the metaphor there, making him almost dehumanizing him, making him seem like a piece of clothing, or making him seem like an object. Really push it further. But those words, torn apart, I'm going to talk about that violent verb, torn, and really focus in on it. Okay? And then my why section, my effect on the reader. Okay? It's going to make me want to sympathize. It's also going to shock me. Because I'm the reader. And hearing him talk about him being torn apart, I could also talk about the fact that it suggests that perhaps his dream is magnifying his experience, pushing it harder, making it seem really more than it actually was. I mean, when he explains it earlier on, it doesn't seem like that, but dreams tend to magnify what we're feeling. And then we talk about the context. I'm going to talk about the fact that it's a real experience, which should also make the reader sympathy with him and shock the reader as well. I'm going to talk about the Gulf War. Now, if I wanted to do some extra research, I could look at Gulf War syndrome. I could look at how soldiers were treated post-Gulf War. There's a little bit of that, not dead. But the main thing I was on here is the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. No need to, by the way, to what post-traumatic stress disorder is in your exam. But talking about the fact that this man's life has been destroyed by it, and the fact that it's trauma that is ongoing and continuing is something you could really put in. Now, in the comparison box on your sheet, you will see that I've got however/similarly, and you can cross out whichever one you want to. I've put however, but it could be similarly. I don't know what poem you've chosen. For example, if we're talking about Kazi, war is traumatizing. War is traumatizing in Kamikaze, but it's traumatizing to the family is what the poem is focused on. That's very expressed, but if I type it a lot easier. Okay, how is it done? I might pick the quotations about when she's referring to her father and talk about the fact that she never actually refers to him as her dad. It's never really there. And I would then talk about the method being used, use of the pronoun. And then the why, the effect on the reader, makes you want to sympathise with the family this time. So although it's a similar point, it's been done in a different manner, which is why it's a however. Okay. So what you're going to do now is you're going to pause the video, and this is probably going to take some time, and you are going to complete your planning sheet. Okay? So pause the video, complete your planning sheet. There's a little bit on the end of this before I go off. So pause your video and come back to me, because I've just realised that I was supposed to do these bits. Gosh, you can tell I've not done this before. So I've already talked these through, but we need to do it 3 times. Magic number, you want to show a range of ideas. Okay. So before we cool down, like when we've been in the gym. So I want you to write down your answers to these 3 poems. So these 3 questions. Number 1, why did you pick your poem? Number 2, what's the most obvious difference between it and remains? And what's the most important thing to know about the poem you chose? What's the key theme in that poem? Remember, these poems have similarities, but every single one of them is different. I absolutely love Remains. I'm really, really looking forward to reading about what you've written. This week, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to submit your plan. You can plan on showing my homework as a Word document, photograph, a Word document. It's a lot easier for me to give you detailed feedback. But if you can send me a JPEG, try and make photographed it in portrait phone, because That's so much easier. And yeah, let me on. If you submit, you put your email address on things, I will be able to give you a little bit more detail because I can email you back, especially if it's a Word document, I can email you back with loads of comments on it. You to do next week when you write. Okay. So to seeing you guys really soon. Miss you. Oh my God, miss you guys. Miss silly jokes. Everything about being in the classroom. I'm barely getting content. My bum is on this show. Speak to you guys soon. See ya. Bye.